Hello and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to show you this colored pencil drawing of a river landscape, but it was done on sandpaper, and drawing with colored pencils on sandpaper is a little bit different than drawing on regular paper, so we're going to talk about that a little bit more. But first I want to say a few words about the general things. Here I'm trying to work out the composition using my green colored pencil. I'm trying to work out where the line of the horizon will be, where the sky will be, and where I will place the river and some of the main elements in my drawing. The size of this sandpaper is about 5 × 9 inches, and it's a waterproof fine grain, 1000 grain sandpaper. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is I'm going to put down some white pencil on the sky because I want to make the sky a little bit lighter. Now I don't have any lighter blue colored pencils, or I don't have any sky blue colored pencils, which is why I'm going to put down some white first, so that the blue that I put down over it would end up being a little bit lighter. I'm going to blend that using a combination of my finger and some regular tortillons. Tortillons will be my main blending tool here when working on sandpaper, because fingers usually aren't accurate enough, and also sandpaper tends to be a little bit hard on the fingertips. So one of the things that I mentioned in the intro was that working on sandpaper, or any sanded paper for that matter, is quite different when you're using colored pencils. They tend to behave completely differently, because colored pencils, when you work on a regular paper, they tend not to spread, they tend not to cover large areas of paper very quickly, and they tend not to blend well at all. You usually have to use solvents, or you have to layer them gradually and patiently. Now when you're working on sandpaper, it's a completely different experience, and they behave a lot more like pastel pencils. If you worked with pastel pencils, you'll find that when you work with colored pencils on sandpaper, they work a lot more like pastel pencils. There are lots of similarities. There are also some differences, but I do find that working with colored pencils on sandpaper is a very enjoyable, interesting experience. So you can see now that I've put down some light blue on top of that white, I'm able to achieve some very light blue color, and I'm able to blend it fairly evenly. I wouldn't really be able to do such a thing, or at least I wouldn't be able to do it quite as quickly on regular drawing paper. Now I'm going to start working on the lower portion of the paper. Of course, I'm going to be adding some details to the sky a little bit later, but this is good enough for now. So there's going to be some kind of a small river or a stream here, and we're going to have some nice reflections. Right now I'm just kind of experimenting with colors, trying to figure out which ones I want to use. So I picked one of the greens, which will be my mid-tone or base tone for the grass here, and I'm going to be adding some lighter and darker tones to it in order to give that grass more texture, to modify its tone a little bit, and also to give it a little more depth and make it look a little bit more realistic. So I added some yellows, I added some other colors, and I'm blending that in with a tortilla. The grass will be a little bit darker in this top part here, because there's going to be a bit of shadow from the trees. So I blended that in, and once that is done, I'm going to start working on the trees. I've already done some videos on how to draw trees in colored pencils, so I'm going to use a similar approach, although this is a slightly different medium. Now, I know that some of you will probably be asking which colored pencils I'm using. I'm mostly using either Staedtler's or Faber-Castell Polychromos colored pencils. And I have to tell you right away that I think that Faber-Castell Polychromos, they are oil-based colored pencils. They tend to work a little bit better on this sandpaper. And the main reason why I prefer to use them, even though I've used Staedtler's here as well, because I don't have all of the colors, but the main advantage is that they tend to stick to the surface of the paper a little bit more, so the residue and smudging is not that much of an issue. You don't really have to use a fixative afterwards, because colored pencils, they tend to stick to the surface of the paper. Now with a drawing paper it's a lot easier. With sanded paper or sandpaper that I'm using, because these colored pencils behave like pastel pencils, there are a lot of the dust left and it can easily be smudged. But this doesn't seem to be the case with all of the brands. So for example, the Polychromos don't really smudge that much at all. You can pretty much work with them and get away with using nothing but colored pencils and not even using any fixative on top. And the reason why I'm kind of against using fixative, or at least using too much fixative here, is because it will tend to change the appearance of your drawing, and sometimes if you use too much or if you spray at a close distance, it will tend to ruin your artwork, or maybe not ruin it, but you'll have to rework it, so that's a problem. But when you use slightly harder oil-based colored pencils like Faber-Castell's, I find that they tend to stick even to the sandpaper surface pretty well, so smudging is not that much of an issue. Anyway, back to what I'm doing. Let me just explain what's happening here. I first used that green as my base color, and then I started using some black on top of that. I used black for two reasons, for two purposes. First, I want to modify the green a little bit to make the color a little bit more dull and a little bit darker in some areas. And I also want to break up that green area into clumps or groups or clusters of leaves, so that my trees and bushes in front of them would appear to have some depth and shape. So I can't just draw a circular or a round shape and expect it to look like tree. I need to work a little bit more on structure and texture and things like that. Now I'm gonna make it look like some of the tree trunks and branches are visible through these bushes and through this foliage. And I'm also going to make some parts of those tree trunks and branches a little bit lighter and others a little bit darker. I'm going to use a brown and I'm going to darken it a little bit here and there with a black. But I want some of these lighter ones to stand out because I want to have some nice contrast with the dark shadow areas inside that foliage. Another thing that I'm doing with a black color pencil is I'm creating some leaf or foliage like texture by putting down either some dots or circular like scribbling motions to make this look like a bunch of distant trees, or rather leaves. And I'm kind of hoping that it'll be realistic enough, but of course the big thing, the most important thing, is to capture the general shape, the general appearance of the tree by getting the shape right and by defining these lighter and darker areas and by breaking the foliage into clusters of leaves. I'm adding some clouds to the sky. I'm putting some white colored pencil on top of the blue areas, and I'm kind of blending or softening some parts of those clouds because I want some of them to stand out in contrast against the background, while other parts, like for example the lower part of the cloud, I want it to be a little bit less defined because it's a little bit darker and I want it to kind of fade into the blue background. And because my background here, this sandpaper, is like a dark bluish grey, sometimes the background will start to come through, to break through your colors, and when that happens you just have to apply a little bit more. Now here I want to make it look like light is coming through some of these canopies. I don't want to make them completely opaque. I want to make it look like there are some holes in there, some spaces where the light is coming through, like maybe where the branches in the foliage isn't quite as thick or quite as dense. Now I'm going to use this much lighter green to go over these mid-range or mid-tone greens that I've used previously. And this is a slightly warmer, livelier color, but at the same time it's a little bit lighter, and it's going to make these clusters of leaves a little bit more three-dimensional. My light source is coming mainly from above, but a little bit more from the right side than the left, so the right side of everything is going to be a little bit lighter. I'm going to draw some distant trees and bushes here on the horizon, and these are a little bit closer to us. We're going to have some objects further in the distance behind them. So I'm going to make them a little bit darker first, and I'm also going to try to make some suggestions of lighter and darker areas here as well. And of course I'm going to be adding a little bit more shadow at the bottom of all of these trees and bushes, where I would expect there to be a bit more shadow, but I'm also trying to create some random texture just to break up that green area and give it a little bit more shape. Some of it is almost entirely random, and I'm just going with the flow, as it were. I went over it with a little bit of blue as well, because it's further in the distance, and because of the atmospheric effect, things tend to get a little bit less defined and a little bit more vague and bluish as you look further into the distance. Now I drew some hills or maybe mountains here in the distance, and I'm going to make them as well a little bit more bluish, so that it looks like they are way back in the background. And this is how you create depth in your landscapes. This is one of the rules that you want to remember if you want to create realistic looking landscapes with a nice feeling of depth. You have to keep in mind that atmospheric effect, which makes things in the background, which are further in the distance, less defined in terms of contrast and detail, and a little bit more bluish or greyish in terms of color. Now I'm going to add a little more variation to this terrain here on this left bank of the river. I don't want all of it to be grass. I want some of it to be ground or dirt or mud, and I want a few bushes here and there. If my footage isn't always quite as sharp or clear, I'm sorry about that. but I will do my best to explain the drawing process nonetheless. So here I'm going to start drawing that river, and there's going to be some reflections here. And as always with reflections, you want to try to match the image above the water. I went back to drawing this tree or a group of trees on the left, and I'm adding some more of that lighter green as well as some black here and there to emphasize those shadow areas and to create more depth in that foliage. I'm using this lighter green on top to make some of the lighter leaves stand out, so that the viewer can feel like maybe some parts of that foliage are deeper in the shadows while others are protruding or sticking out and getting more light from above. I'm also using that black colored pencil to create some suggestions of shadow areas in the grass, maybe between some larger clumps of grass, because I don't want to make the grass look too uniform. I want some variation in the terrain. And as I'm doing that, I'm also adding some highlights using some lighter pencils, like lighter green, or maybe even some other colors, some brownish or other tones which are a little bit lighter. And I also want to create a little bit of variation in terms of not just value but also in terms of tone. But here I'm back to working on the foliage and trying to define these tree trunks which are visible in between the shadows of the canopies, and adding some more texture to them, adding more of these dots and various irregular shapes to imitate the texture of the trees, of the leaves. Even though this is a slightly smaller drawing, in real time it took about maybe 2.5 hours, not really sure, but some parts of this footage are going to be a little bit more compressed into a time lapse, others are going to be a little bit longer. I tried to show some portions of the drawing process in real time to demonstrate some of the technique, and then I simply continue with the time lapse and I speed up a little bit, because I'm hoping that I've explained what I'm doing to a sufficient degree so that you could understand and follow along even with the time lapse. Now, if you want to see longer videos, whether they are landscape videos or some other types of videos, you can always check out my Patreon, where I have lots of full-length videos where you can draw along, observe my drawing technique in real time, and hear some much longer narration and explanations. With the river here, I'm using the same approach as with the sky. I used a bit of white on this lighter area first, and then I'm going to go over it with some blue. But I'm also adding some brownish or reddish brown and ochreish tones to the shore, to the banks, because like I said, I want some variation in terms of color, and I do think that these are very nice colors, so it's a very nice looking landscape. Right now I'm blending in the blue and the white. I'm going to make the surface of the river ever so slightly darker than the sky, but I do need to try to match the reflections. I need to try to match the reflection with the image above. That's why I'm putting in some of these clouds here. And I roughly positioned the clouds more or less in the same place where they are above the horizon line, so that it looks like they are reflected in the water. Now I'm going to do a reflection of this wooded area here on the left, and I'm going to need to create a mixture of these greens, dark greens, lighter greens, and even some darker areas, black areas, and some lighter brown areas. And I'm going to have to smudge that a little bit and distort the image a bit so that it looks like a real reflection. And I'm also going to try to reflect some of the colors from above, so that the reflection looks more convincing. Now, because of the ripples in the water, the image is going to be distorted, but like I said, I need to try to match the positioning of the areas of lighter values roughly, even though the image is a little bit distorted. I think right now it's starting to look like a realistic looking river, and I deliberately want the upper part of that river to be a little bit lighter in terms of value, because it's the sky is lighter there and there's a few more clouds there. But there's also going to be a reflection from those trees way in the background in the center of my drawing. So far I've done about 2/3 of my drawing, and I'm moving on to the right side more and more. But here in the center I need to reflect or create reflections of these trees here. These are going to be a little bit darker. I mean, the reflection is going to have to appear a little bit darker. And there's going to be some green tones as well. But there's also going to be some lighter white tones to create some water effects, ripple-like effects and reflections. And of course, a good thing about colored pencils on sandpaper is that you can easily move the pigment around, which is not really what you can do with regular paper. So this is a regular sandpaper that you can buy in a hardware store. It's a waterproof, fine-grained sandpaper. I prefer 1,000 grain. You can 600 or 800 would also work fine, I think, but I just prefer this one. Now, if you wanted to try some of the more expensive artist quality sanded papers, I guess you could try pastel matte. And if you want to try something more similar to the sandpaper I'm using, that would be UArt, especially 800 grain UArt paper. Would probably behave in a similar way, or interact with the colored pencils in a similar way. I've already talked about the advantages of using sandpaper with pastel pencils and colored pencils in some of my previous videos, and I also covered the archival versus the non-archival issue, which I think is not much of an issue, and people worry too much about that, honestly. But whatever you may think about regular sandpaper as a medium for drawing with colored pencils, I think if you try it, you'll find that it's a lot of fun. It makes working with colored pencils very easy and very enjoyable, much more enjoyable than regular drawing paper. That I can tell you. So you should experiment and see what happens. That's my suggestion. I just like the pieces that I do on sandpaper a little bit better than the ones on regular paper, but we'll see. I'm going to do a few more drawings on this sandpaper, and then I'll decide whether I'll go back to drawing on regular paper, or I'll keep doing some more drawings on this sandpaper. But I of course do prefer regular drawing paper and charcoal. That's the medium that I just like to use most of the time. So there's a little bit of reflection here on this part of the land which is sticking out on the right. I've mostly done most of the reflections and the water, and I'm going to be moving on to the right side of the drawing where I need to finish some trees. I need to do these canopies in the top right part of my drawing, and they need to be done in a similar way as the trees on the left. So I'm breaking the canopy into smaller clumps of leaves or clumps of foliage. I'm giving that a little bit of texture and a change of tone using a black colored pencil. I'm also making it look like some of the branches and parts of the tree trunk are sticking out through these canopies or through the foliage. So basically I'm doing whatever is needed to create a realistic looking tree, like I did in many of my previous videos. I'm going to put some grass or reed here in the foreground. I thought that it would be a nice touch in front of this surface of the water, in front of these reflections here. So I think that creates even more depth in the drawing. Whenever you put something in front of something else in a landscape, that kind of helps the viewer understand the depth and have that illusion of depth, like they're looking at an actual scene, an actual landscape. Some more trees and bushes here on the right. And a lot more grass. I also need to add a few more clouds here, just for the sake of balance. Now I'm working on the tree all the way on the right. I don't need to make it quite as detailed as the ones that are closer to the center. Right now I'm going to use that green which I used as my base color to cover this whole area on the lower right part of the paper. And I'm not really going to be adding too many details here. I'm just going to make it look like grass, but I'm adding some yellowish or some lighter tones to create some variation in the terrain in terms of texture and color and value. It doesn't have to be the exact same combination of colors as on the left, but I'm trying to make it look similar. I'm using my tortillon for blending here and there. I'm adding some reddish browns or lighter browns to the terrain, and now I'm going to draw a small dirt path leading from those trees on the right all the way to the riverbank and going down here on the right side of the river, starting narrow and small in the distance and then getting gradually thicker and larger as it gets closer to the viewer. I used an ivory colored pencil to add some lighter details on that path to make it look more three-dimensional, and I'm adding some details with a black colored pencil. Here I add a darker area on the right to make it look like this portion of the ground is sticking out like a small hill. And I'm also going to use that black colored pencil to create some suggestions of darker areas or shadow areas in the grass, like I did on the left side. And now I'm using that lighter green to add some blades of grass, but I'm using some other greens as well. But mostly this lighter green because I've already established some darker tones and some mid-tones. So I'm using that Faber-Castell lighter green to create some areas or clumps of lighter grass, and naturally in order to create that feeling of depth, I'm drawing the blades of grass which are closer to us. They're a little bit larger and taller, and they get smaller and smaller as you look further into the distance. So it's going to be a pretty simple scene, but with some nice colors. I did this mostly as a demonstration of a colored pencil landscape because I don't do many of those, but also as a demonstration of how well colored pencils work on sandpaper, and they tend to work really well on this medium. I drew some flowers in the distance, some white flowers, maybe a couple of blue ones here and there, and eventually I decided to add some yellow ones because I just like yellow color, and I thought that it would be a nice touch. Again, I'm going to do the same thing with the grass, make the ones that are closer to the viewer a little bit larger, and then very small and almost like small dots or points as you move further away. So I hope that this video was useful to you and that you will try out drawing with colored pencils on sandpaper. If you can't find artistic quality sanded paper, you can just use regular sandpaper. I put my signature in the lower right corner, and now the drawing is done. I hope you'll like it. I hope you'll also subscribe and check out my other videos. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.